Lorenzo Dow Turner. And then in a class with someone who's in the audience, Josephine Bradley, I said Georgia State, at Emory University in graduate school. We took some courses together, and I decided in Richard Long's class, that would be my project. I would study the Gullah Geechee people, and then I kind of got a little bit deeper into it. But then when I took the position at Georgia State University, there was a sister who was there, Beatrice Morales, who was in the anthropology department, and she was taking students to Sapelo Island, Georgia. And my students, I was teaching a class on African Americans in Georgia, on our history and heritage in Georgia. And my students said, we want to take a trip to Sapelo, can we get extra credit for that? And I said, where is that? Sapelo, what's that? And from that experience, and then when Dr. Morales left Georgia State, I kind of took over some of her work in terms of trying to take our students there, and Mary has carried that work on and taken it to a new level. So that's how I even got involved in this particular topic. First, like, who are the Gullah Geechee people? The Gullah Geechee people are a part of African people in North America, right? But they're a special, particular part of our community and our people, our ethnic group, however you want to frame us or determine what we are. Some people say we're a nation, okay? But if you look at us, they're one of the groups, if not the group, who maintain the most of our heritage coming from Africa. Sometimes people might say the Creoles of Louisiana, southern Louisiana. But those two groups have maintained the most, and then language has been the vehicle that's happened. Language and spirituality with the Gullah Geechee people have been a vehicle for maintaining that identity and heritage. It's interesting. I remember traveling on a ferry with a guy from Sapelo, and an elder from Sapelo, and him talking about when he was growing up and them going to the mainland, they were taught to be ashamed of how they spoke. But now we have this revival, and there's a pride in the language that people speak in this particular place. So where's the heritage from? You know, the Gullah Geechee people we know from Lorenzo Dow Turner's work, and also research has been done by others, primarily comes from not all of Africa, but specifically there's a talk of people coming from the Sierra Leone area, from the Mende speaking peoples, and so you have that heritage there. Some of us, and I would say some people almost say the Gullah Geechee people's heritage is almost exclusively from there. I would doubt that, and Lorenzo Dow Turner's work actually challenges that, right? Because it shows a variety of ethnic groups throughout Africa that influence the Gullah Geechee language. But we know from the Senegambia area that there's a heritage that comes from there. And we know that it comes from the West Central Africa, even though we know that the West Central Africa, which when we talk about Congo, Angola, it mostly influences South Carolina and not as much Georgia. Why? Because after the Stono Rebellion of 1739, then white folks stopped bringing in people from that particular area, right? They stopped bringing in people from the Congo and Angola area. They thought that they were more rebellious, right? We know that we have an influence from the Igbo people of southeast and south central Nigeria, but that declines. Why? Because those of you who've been to St. Simon's Island and you've gone and seen Igbo landing, you know the story of Africans who joined hand and walked into the sea. And after that, white folks said, that's a bad investment. I'm not gonna take Africans from that region. We also, we know from that work and other works, we have people from the Gold Coast area around the area of Ghana and Ivory Coast. And so from those places, you have this confluence, not exclusively those places, because most people who study the Middle Passage would say that there was a small number of people who came from Southwest Nigeria, you know, for instance, the Yoruba people, and they will come to the United States, the continental United States. But then in Lorenzo Dow Turner's work, you see the name Akinyele, which is my name, which comes from the Yoruba people. Now, there's different ways we can explain that, and historians and anthropologists are still debating that right now. one explanation for it might be is we know that one of the reasons the Gullah Geechee Islands, the Gullah Geechee region has dynamic amount of African retentions is the fact that we were still being brought there after the slave trade legally ended in the United States, right? So after 1807, y'all know in the United States Constitution, it approved slave trade for like 20 more years. So from that period, from the founding of the United States, when was it founded? 76, okay, I forgot that. I've been out of elementary for a while. And some of that stuff I try to forget. Okay, I'm sorry. But from 1776 till they established, I think it was in 1786, when the Constitution takes place, because you know they were operating on the Articles of Confederation, they ended legally bringing Africans into the country. Now, y'all know that cocaine is illegal to bring in the United States too, right? But cocaine still ends up on our streets. And then similarly, Africans were brought to places where there wasn't a lot of monitoring going on, and the Sea Islands were one of the places that we were dropped off. So we know that there were ships at least into the late 1850s that were dropping folks off into these islands. So it's possible, particularly because also during that period, you got a lot of Yoruba people in the Middle Passage. Why? Because they had civil wars going on there. So it's possible you could have had people from other places, even that disputes what some of the historians say now. So that's who the Gullah Geechee people are. And like, as again, I say they are part of who we all are. They're just part of the most dynamic part of that. And so, for instance, the historian Michael Gomez argues that African people, when they were enslaved, developed something called polyculturalism. That we developed a culture for when we were being observed by our slaveholders. I don't like to call them masters, because like Mary said, we know who the real master was, right? Okay. By the slaveholders. And then it was a culture we practiced amongst ourselves. The people on the coast of Georgia and South Carolina had a lot more freedom. And they had a lot less observation by the slaveholders. There was a whole different form of how labor was constructed there, right? They were on what was called a task system, where they were given tasks. They usually had a black overseer. There were more black overseers in Georgia than there were white overseers. They had a black overseer who usually was like your shop steward. He negotiated with, he or she, usually was a he, negotiated with the slaveholder for what was the labor throughout the week. And generally people finished their tasks and they had a lot more freedom. And y'all know, because of the mosquito, white folks wasn't down there too much. So they had the ability to develop their culture and a lot more freedom than where my grandfather was a slave here in Georgia, in Lumpkin, Georgia, Lumpkin County, right? Lumpkin, Georgia, right? In Stewart County, where they worked from can't see to can't see. And there was a lot more observation. And most of the plantations were really not that big. So it wasn't a lot of us, to hide amongst. You know how you can hide in a bunch of people when you've taken those big lecture classes and if you were in college, and you can kind of fall asleep, or now youngsters are on Twitter in class and stuff. But if you're in a graduate seminar with 12 people, the professor can see everybody. Well, that's maybe a bad example, but the plantation sizes were smaller, right? For most of us, you did have some rich white folks who had hundreds of people. But in the Gullah Geechee area, they didn't have to worry about that. They had a lot more freedom, and they could be who they were. So that's another reason for the construction of the Gullah Geechee people. Now, Mary did an excellent job talking about the Bible and about the language, so I won't talk about that much. I'll just say this about the language and how it's related to the rest of us who are of African descent in this country, African descendants. I remember about 10 years ago, I worked as a consultant on a project, I won't mention the project, that looked at the language of the Gullah, and there was a program here at the library. And I was furious because someone asked the question. Because they did an excellent job of presenting the Gullah language, right? But then they asked, well, what's this relationship to Ebonics? And they said, Ebonics? That's just some gibberish, or that's just some, bad English that some folk came up with. And I said, that was an insult. They were talking about my grandmama when they said that. Yeah. And your grandmama too, right? That's an insult. Dr. Smith taught us. Now, I don't like the term Ebonics. I never did. It sounds corny to me. Most languages are named after people, right? Right. Named after people or land or something of that nature. So that's something we're going to have to resolve as we get our identity more intact. But most languages, and I'm not using dialect, I'm using language. Most languages develop because you have a vocabulary, what they call lexicon, right? But the most important feature is how words are sounded, which is phonology, and the morphology, how you structure your communication. Okay, that's the most important feature. Well, some people will say, well, isn't most of the vocabulary English? And that's true. A lot of the vocabulary is English, or how we translate in English. But then, what is most of the vocabulary of English? English is a Germanic language. Most of the vocabulary is Latin and French, of Latin and French origin, okay? But we call English a grammatic language. Why? A Germanic language. Why? Because it's structure and it's how we sound words, or how they sound words in English, because I don't speak the same way as most of them guys, okay? How they sound them out is from the Germanic origin. It has a Germanic genesis. Y'all feel what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so the way black folks speak, the same way that brothers and sisters in Haiti who speak Creole speak, and the same with the Gullah Geechee language and Jamaican patois. That most of us, now some of us have linguistic dexterity, where we can master standard American English and speak in that way when we need to, especially, I know I used to hear my mama when she talked to people on the phone, okay, transacting business, she spoke in standard American English, because my mama was valedictorian in high school and all that, right? So she could do that, right? But then when she talked to us at home, it was something else. And my grandmama, it was even deeper. Y'all feel me? Yeah. Okay, but those elements is what constitute a language. And I agree with Noam Chomsky, a white scholar, for those who need that, okay, who said that what's the difference between a dialect and a language? An army. If you got the political will and the power to determine where your form of communication is the standard, then it's a language. Okay, it's a political question, what's a language and what's a dialect? That's just a political question. Finally, let me wrap up. An important element too we have to look at, particularly as we talk about the Gullah Bible, is, well, what's the spirituality of this people? Okay, and historically, the spirituality of the Gullah people have three origins. One is we talking about the Gullah Bible, so we know there's a Christian influence, right? We could just say a little bit more about that in a second. There's definitely, in some places, an Islamic influence, even when Christianity is practiced. If you read the work of anybody who studies about Sapelo and St. Simon's Island, you'll see that some of, not a majority, but a significant amount of Africans who were enslaved there were Islamic. In fact, in church in Sapelo, up until recent times, women sat on one side of the church, men sat on the other side of the church. First African Baptist church faced the east. So when they prayed, they faced the east, just like in Islam. It was funny, Maurice Bailey, I talked to last night, the son of Cornelia Bailey. He was in town, he's friends with my son-in-law, so they were doing some work together. But when I first met him, he was doing a tour with my students. The students were asking him questions about original edifice of the church. And they asked, why is it facing east? They said, well, isn't that Islamic? He said, well, most Baptists around here be Muslims anyway. But it definitely was an Islamic influence there. But Muslims were never the majority of the Sea Island culture. At least we don't have any evidence of that. There's evidence to the other. They were a minority, and maybe, possibly, they were put in positions as headmen, as overseers, because they were in a minority, so that was something that separated them from the majority. We also know that the majority of Africans enslaved in America, at least at the turn of the last century, turn of the 19th century, in the early 1800s, and up until the 1830s, were not Christians. Well, at least not on church rolls. So what were they doing? What were they doing? So we know that there's a large influence of African traditional religion also in the religion of the Gullah people, and beliefs that are still practiced today. Why did I say that? They used to let you at Sapelo on the graveyard, the main graveyard in Sapelo. What is that called, Mary? Behavior Cemetery, thank you. I knew somebody here could help an old man out. Okay, Behavior Cemetery. They used to let you on there, but you know, us folks from the mainland didn't know how to behave. So when we went on the burial ground and we saw somebody left a pipe out there for their ancestor, we would say, oh, that's a good little souvenir for me to take back to Atlanta. So now they lock it up. But the practice is generally, if you enter Behavior Cemetery, that you gotta greet the folk before you come there. You gotta ask, they say ask leave. Okay, you gotta ask permission before you come on the gravesite. And when you leave, you're supposed to say something, goodbye. You know, like some proper respect that our elders would teach us. And if you read Drums and Shadows, it has old stories from people who lived during the period of enslavement about what would happen to you if you didn't. You would get visited by a shadow who would deal with you if you didn't show proper respect for the dead. And we know that proper respect for the dead in the African context goes beyond even what Europeans taught in Christianity. Because what I would argue, and going along with Michael Gomez and others, is that Christianity for black folks was not the white man's religion. This is a good example of that. What we did was transform Christianity. The majority of us did. You know, we got some people with slave mentalities too, and colonial mentalities. But for the majority of us, we transformed it to make it useful for us, and this is a great example of us taking that something that really is comes out of Western Asia or North Africa, and the Europeans through the Nicene Conference and other things took and transformed and made their own, because I only give them total credit for it, right? But then they presented to us as a form of social control, but then some of our people decided, how can we make this work for us? So when we look at the spirituality of Nat Turner or Harriet Tubman, we can't say that comes from a slave religion, right? They definitely made that a tool, what did Mary say, a weapon for liberation. They made that a weapon for liberation. And so that's how our ancestors, for the most part, that's why after Nat Turner, they said that they had to observe church. You know, when the first African church was formed here, there's now Big Bethel, here in Atlanta, the city of Atlanta, a white man had to preach and be present in the church. But you know, our people went out to other places too. They didn't know everything that was going on, because right in that church they had a secret school that was teaching people how to read and write under their eyes. What do you say, polycultural? Something we let them see, but something we do on our own. So with that being said, let me close up. This issue is not just a historical issue, and it's not just a cultural issue, it's a political one. Because we're talking about a survival of identity, we're talking about a survival of a culture. I agree with Mary, by the Bible, New Testament being translated in Gullah, that's a weapon to help maintain a culture. Because what's happening right now, we can actually say with Gullah people is genocide. They're not all gone, they're still fighting genocide. But there's an attempt by taking the land of the people there to destroy the culture and the entire identity of a people. It's not necessarily putting people in gas ovens, but it's an attempt for profit to destroy a people, and it's something that we need to all be a part of and support it. Thank you.